Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Good Grief Festival. My name is Cathy Rentzenbrink. I've had the pleasure and honour of being at the festival a few times since it started. And I'm never more pleased than I am to be here tonight with Musa Okwonga, who I admire so much for your work, Musa. And it's just such a pleasure to be here with you tonight and I'm so looking forward to our conversation. So well.
Oh, thank you, Cathy. Oh, pleasure, a pleasure. Well, yeah, ask whatever you need. I look forward to talking with you. It'll be fun.
So when I say I've been an admirer of your work for years, what I feel, and you write Musa's a writer, a journalist, a podcaster, writes on a very wide range of subjects. What I feel unifies your work, Musa, is there's this tone of curiosity and this tone of humanity, I always feel, and a tone of compassion. So that's what I feel, that whatever you're writing about, there's sort of this love of humanity underpinning it all, even when you're writing about really difficult things. And I wonder,
thank you.
I might just start by asking you, almost like, is that
accurate?
Right?
No, I think it is. So I think there's a lot. It's funny because I write my books about really personal stuff, and people might think, oh, like this guy is super open, but actually the most devastating things, the things that define my life the most, are things that have happened to other people close to me, and they're things I'll never write about because they're not my stories to tell. And having seen people so close to me experience such difficult things, it gives you a sense of compassion because you're permanently aware of how brutal the world is and how unfair the world is from a very early age. And that never leaves you, actually. So what then happens is, when I navigate the world as a writer, you're always doing it with a kind of gentleness, because the gentleness is a gratitude. It's a gratitude that life didn't attack you in so brutal a fashion. Not a smugness, it's different. It's the kind of, for example, now, as we sit talking, at least twice there, I've thought to myself, there are rockets crashing into the side of an apartment building in Ukraine or Sudan. There are people being abducted right now in Iran without questioning and held without trial. Like, that's happening as we speak. And that compassion in my writing comes from the fact that, people in my extended family, people who my mother's known, my parents have known, they've been taken away in the night, middle of the day, and never seen again. And that's never far from your mind. So whenever I write about anything, the current that flows beneath all of that is that knowledge, I think.
But I think, other people have those experiences and can take them in a different direction, can't it? To sort of bitterness, or
they can.
It feels to me there's some hope in your writing, which again,
there is hope, because look, whenever something terrible happens to a friend of mine, whenever a friend of mine has an act of cruelty inflicted upon them, I just say, look, that person doesn't have the right to change you. Because that's actually how all these systems work, these ideologies work. They work by making you become embittered and cruel, and they don't. I tell my siblings this the whole time. I tell my friends this. Nobody has the right to change you. No one has the right to not change you in a better way, but to make you cruel. No one has that right. Yeah.
That's beautiful. Thank you very much. So we're here to talk about your book. In the end, it was all about love. Look at us. Yay.
It's very shiny. That's very shiny here.
And I thought, obviously, because we're at the Good Grief Festival, I'm going to be focusing on the grief elements of it. But what I was thinking today, as I was rereading it specifically for this, I was thinking that I don't think if someone asked me what this book was, I don't think I'd say the word grief at the beginning, and I don't think I'd really call it a grief memoir. And then I thought maybe I would, because maybe grief is underpinning the whole thing. But I thought I might ask you what you think your book is about.
Well, it's funny because I think it's one of the reasons it took so long to publish it, is that people didn't know what to call it. So shout out to my agent, Abby Fellows, and to Rough Trade Books for actually taking a chance on it and believing in it. I think for me, it's a book about the human condition and all the things we experience. And within that, grief is one huge part. It's a universal thing. And a big theme in the book is the book is a kind of semi-fictional account of my first 4 years in Berlin. A lot of the things in the book happened to me. A lot happened to other people I know who, whose stories I imparted with their consent. And other parts are clearly fiction because there's magic realism in there as well. But grief is a core element of the book. And a core element of the book is how grief impacts us from an early age and how the most important people in our lives can be those we never met. So, my father died when I was 4 years old. We never had any kind of relationship because, 4 is too young to build up that rapport. And yet he's been one of the most important figures in my life for as long as I've been alive. And grief does that, actually.
Could you tell us a little bit more about how he came to die?
Yeah, sure. So my parents are both doctors. Well, my father was a doctor. They met while medical students in Uganda in the 1970s. They fled Uganda because of Idi Amin. When Idi Amin was overthrown in the early 80s, my father was like, well, I need to go back to Uganda, having fled to the UK, and had me at the age of, so they had me about 4 years after they fled. That was 1979. My father went back to Uganda and he served as the chief military surgeon for the chief of staff, who was the resistance to the current president in Uganda. So he went back in 1983. He was killed. His helicopter was shot down along with the chief of staff. That was in 83. And yeah, the first time, I think I've written about this, but the first time I actually encountered my father was his coffin in the living room. Well, the first memory I have of him was his coffin in the living room of our house in Uganda. One of our properties, and we had a property in Uganda as well as in London. So yeah, that was the kind of formative memory. The second memory was actually burying him. So if you're the son, you get to put the first bit of dirt on the grave. So that was my second memory. First memory, the coffin. Second memory, the burial, the funeral. Yeah.
I was just so struck when reading that, like what a thing that is. That is the first memory of your father.
You don't realize how big it is till you talk to other people.
Mm.
And they have dads that are basically alive till 80, 90. I had one friend the other day on Facebook. He was talking about this amazing relationship he had with his father, and they were like best friends. And I wasn't envious because there was no point of contact. It just has I have no concept of having a father. No concept. So, and that what that does, that affects your decision-making processes because you have no one to run it by because there's no one older than you to go up to. And, uncles aren't the same. Male mentors do a great job. I've had a couple of amazing male mentors, but it's not the same. The other thing it does actually is it gives you a very strange relationship with mortality because, as strange as it sounds, I'm 43 now, until the age of 36, actually, no, even later, 38, 39, my dad died when he was 40. I thought I was not going to live past the age of 40 because I did not have a concept of life beyond the age of 40 for someone who looked like me. Mm-hmm. So yeah, so again, this whole thing of I've done nothing with my life. My life is a kind of a ticking clock. I thought I was going to drop dead at the age of 40. It sounds ridiculous now, but that's literally what I thought because there was no precedent for it.
Yeah, I understand that. And that's the thing, isn't it? That your reality might be unusual, but it's your reality.
It's mine, yeah.
And actually, Julia Samuel, who's a grief therapist and a really brilliant woman, really helped me understand that because I used to think I was crazy, that I thought that people would get knocked over. And she just said that in your reality, that's what happens at the end of a happy day. Like it gets destroyed because someone gets knocked over. So, and she sort of helped me see, and that's the thing, isn't it? That was your reality in your own world. That's what happens.
And actually writing the book helped me to heal, to be honest. Mm-hmm. Because it made me examine things. Because the thing about these traumas and these problems, these processes, we have to do the hard work of going there and examining them. And a lot of people don't want to open that box. Mm-hmm. A lot of men don't go to therapy, or men in particular. Everyone, a lot of people could go if they could afford to, but men in particular, because they're so afraid of what they'll find. People are afraid if they look in that mirror, they'll fall apart. Mm-hmm. The most frightening thing I've ever done as an adult is return to my grandfather's grave, my father's grave, his village in the north of Uganda, because that was like looking in the mirror in a very spiritual sense. And I didn't want to go, but huge thank you for my mum to persuade me to go, because it changed my life, actually. Yeah.
You say also somewhere about how, again, although you've never known your father, his opinion really matters.
Yeah.
I was very sort of moved and kind of hope part of the change maybe is that you don't have to do this, that you would negatively compare yourself to him, think that you weren't good enough, worry about what he would make of your life and that he'd find you wanting.
Disappointing, yeah. And it's funny because I'm totally at peace with that now. It's so strange. Like, that fear absolutely disappeared when I went to the north of Uganda and saw his grave. Because like my father was one of the first ever, one of the first Black consultant surgeons in the UK. And it felt like for a long time I was traveling his footsteps. So for example, a few years ago, I was actually booked to speak at the University of Edinburgh about race and politics. And I ended up giving a speech in one of the very same halls where he would have studied as a fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons. So it was this real sort of sense of kind of a pilgrimage. And I think at a certain point in my life, I'd done enough things with my life that were sufficiently out there in terms of risk that someone like him might actually be, no, you've actually done enough now. So yeah, as spiritual as that sounds, it really had an impact, a very real impact on me.
Could you tell us a bit about, when you talk about going home to Uganda, you say grief has a vast blast radius.
Yeah.
Which I thought was a brilliant way of expressing it. Could you talk to us a little bit more about that?
Right. So grief is a form of explosion, right? It's the biggest spiritual explosion you can experience. And it has strange effects. So when someone's grieving, the blast radius basically means that people are there's a distance that people retreat to when someone's grieving, either out of respect or out of shame. So when my mother lost my father, she was a widow, and that was a stigma, because to lose your partner that young, people thought you were unlucky a lot of the time. So people kind of withdrew from her. There's also the blast radius that you experience with other people, where, let's say, for example, I went to, a private school, I went to Eton College, and at a school like that, because people are so wealthy and so comfortable, bad luck or circumstances conspire against you far less. So it's far less common for someone from a rich background, very obviously, to lose someone in tragic circumstances than someone from a poor background. So what happens is, you will have in a world like Eton 20 kids that grow up and one will die of cancer at 15. And the rest, all the parents, the blast radius is basically the parents who lose their child will have to watch everyone else grow old, have kids, have grandkids, and they're permanently stuck with their child at the age of 16, and everyone else is off like being, whatever. And that's the blast radius, where you're grieving by yourself on your island and everybody else is on the mainland looking over at you, and they're talking to you. Sometimes they're not even in earshot, because there's a thing that grief does with earshot as well. Sorry, not to sound too ableist. It's just that grief almost, it muffles, and people talk about walking through life in a kind of a coma almost after, when they're grieving. And that's what I meant by the blast radius. When it goes off like that, it puts you in a space that's so isolated, even in a crowd of people. And other people's joy can actually emphasize your discomfort, because you're dealing with something so private and painful that most people just aren't even navigating. So yeah, that's my short answer.
And it can be a very lonely place, can't it?
Extremely, extremely, yeah. It's almost as lonely. The weird thing is, I used to be a Christian, and the thing about faith and grappling with faith, there's a privacy to faith and grief that actually have quite a big overlap. Because if you're truly a Christian, you grapple with the unfairness of the world, and you try to reconcile that with God's plan. And I think grief is part of that too. You're grappling with, how can this happen to this person? And that unfairness permanently marks you, I think.
What I find with when I read your book, because I often teach from it, because I think one of the things you do a very good job of is the use of the second person, which I think is, as I say, I tell my students, it's very tricky to pull off this, but here's a good example of it, but still don't try. It's still very hard to pull off, but if you must, look at this. And the thing is, I do know, although I know and have always known that it isn't a memoir, the more I read and engage with it, the more I realize it just feels extremely true to me. Even though I know that it isn't, even though I know that parts of it are fictional, and as you say, there's some magic realism elements. But again, I find as I read it, I kind of slightly don't even notice. I just accept it all as true.
Perfect.
But I wondered if you tell us a little bit about Dr. Okwonga, because apart from everything else, he gives some very good advice, I think, in that, that therapy.
Someone asked if that man was real. I'm like, clearly not. Like he exists on a spiritual plane. He's clearly, but I'm so glad that people got so catfished by the writing that they thought he was real in the end. But no, so he's a completely fictional character, Dr. Okwonga. For those who don't, he's Ghanaian German therapist who basically counsels the protagonist in the book. He's the only character in the book. There's Muhammad. There's only two characters in the book who have a name, and he's one of them. And he's just extremely wise about how to deal with pain and grief, how to confront it, how to forgive yourself, how to move forward. And he's not a real character at all. But I'm glad that he feels real, to be honest. And if I'm honest with you, I cannot believe I got away with that section of the book. When the editors sent it, when Rough Trade sent it back, and they were like, "Yeah, the edits are here," and I was like, they hadn't touched that section at all. And I was like, "How have I done this?" How?
I might just look up his little paragraph of advice, actually, because I think I was thinking about it and thinking we could all do to. Can I read it? Do you mind?
Oh, please. No, please.
Okay, so this is the doctor. He says, "Take care of your private self," he says. "Treat yourself to your own company." Isn't that unbelievably beautiful? This is me now, not reading, because I've jumped out of that start commenting. I just thought, what a beautiful thing. Treat yourself to your own company. I just thought, what a beautiful thing. Reduce your exposure to social media. Staying on there too long seems to make you more anxious. The attacks from strangers, the anticipation of hatred. And stop trying to please everyone. There will be times when people will dislike you for doing what is right for you, and that is fine. And I thought, you go for it, Dr. Okwonga. That's extremely nice. And I felt I wanted to just sort of share it with everyone.
Hard-earned wisdom, hard-earned.
Yeah. Obviously within the book, there's this the grief for your father, this sort of lifelong experience you've had of living with that absence. And I think sometimes one of the defining things about almost like long-range grief is that absence becomes almost as important as presence. But then I also thought the book starts with the writer arriving in Berlin. And I was so interested in the way that the sort of the hope and excitement of the new place is coupled with both the loneliness and a kind of a desire that keeps being thwarted, and fear. And I wondered if you would talk to us a bit about that.
Yeah, of course. Now, the book deals with arriving in Berlin and navigating the city, but it's really for anyone who's ever moved to a new town and had to start from scratch, which is what I encountered when I was 34. And the courage, really the resilience to somehow keep going. When I moved to Berlin, a friend said to me, "You're moving to Berlin, that's a big step, moving to Germany. What if it doesn't work out?" And I was like, "It will work. I'll make it work." And she looked at me and she said, "Yeah, that's why it will work. Because I just refused to let it fail." And there were times when it was extremely difficult. As anyone, Berlin is a tough city regardless, right? It's a tough city for anyone. It's a tough city for white heterosexual Christians from conservative families. It's tough for them. And as a dark-skinned Black man who's also bisexual, it's tough for me. Absolutely, it's tough. And it was tough for all those reasons, and also just because, you know, price of property is flying up. And at the time I set the book in 2017, around that time, so Brexit's happened, Trump's been elected, the far right is surging all over Europe. It's surging again, that's another story. But at that time, it felt like it was really a moment. It was extremely dangerous. And it was like, how do you love yourself and others in such hostile times? How do you have the courage to keep persevering, to keep getting back out there after, you know, in a couple of cases, you know, horrific personal setbacks, professional, personal upsets that were just awful. And actually, even after the book came out, you know, really, really tough stuff kept happening. So, for example, in the middle of the pandemic, this is a specific example of what happened. This in terms of how tough Berlin can be. So in Berlin, well, this is more like life really, but so in Berlin, when the pandemic started in 2020, they gave 5,000 euros to everyone in the country, regardless of their economic status. They were like, look, here's a one-off payment. Everyone's going to need a cash injection. Now the initial fund was limited, right? So everyone got their money in the end, but the startup fund, the desperation fund, basically, that 5,000 was money that was limited. So I kind of thought to myself, trying to be a kind of good socialist, I thought, you know what? I'm not earning a huge amount of money, but I'm earning decent money. Let me leave that 5,000 euros for someone who has got a couple of kids, like a single parent with kids. And I don't regret that decision, because as it turned out, the money all ran out within a couple of days because everyone claimed it. And there are people that really need that money. I spoke to a lady who got the money, and that's a good thing that I didn't take it. Having said that, a week after making that decision, I got laid off my main freelance job by ESPN. 7 years with ESPN, and they laid me off in the middle of the pandemic. That's at the very start. And so this kind of like economic crash, this precarity of like trying to do the right thing. And it felt like for so long in this city, trying to do the right thing just got you, as I mentioned in the book, punched in the stomach. Putting yourself out there, whether it was emotionally, spiritually, professionally, often the world almost took revenge on that. And the reason I have the book's title is because it's about staying gentle. It's about staying open and compassionate despite these setbacks. And I think, yeah, I just persevered. And the book is about that. It's about persevering. It's about staying compassionate despite the most brutal things that society can throw at you, and Berlin in particular.
And I was thinking as I was reading it, possibly not in, again, it's that I always think it's so interesting when you read books and you read them again, and then you have a different, you know, I have a different relationship with a book when I'm reading it for the first time, or when I have a different relationship when I'm reading it to teach something from, and then when I'm talking to the author about it. And again, a different relationship because this is for the Good Grief Festival than I would do if it kind of like sends my mind down a particular thing. And I was just thinking of that word grief in relation to sort of wider societal things and race and injustice.
Yes.
And I wondered, would you talk to us a bit about that? I felt grief is the right word for that, isn't it?
It is the right word. Look, because, you know, as a woman, there's a grief when you walk into a space and you're objectified for your gender, because you know it's never going to go beyond your gender, and you're there to connect with people in a new space, and they're never going to get beyond that. And there's grief as a Black man going and working in certain parts of Germany, even just like 2 weeks ago. You're working in like these beautiful small towns, but then also these are beautiful small towns where a high proportion of the population vote for actual Nazi parties. The AfD is a Nazi, it's a fascist party, right? So that's the grief of going into those spaces, knowing that you will never connect with these people, or most of them, on an honest spiritual level, that the fear is so great, you'll never be fully human to them. That's a grief. The grief of the only life you get to live, and the only life that I get to live, I'll go through it not being processed as fully human by so many people just because of my sexuality, just because of my race. That is heartbreaking. That's devastating. That is a grief that never goes away, because I'd love nothing more than to travel all over the world and go into like a nice bar for coffee and be able to spontaneously be like, hey, like, what's going on in this town, what's going on tonight, and just have that connection on a human level. And that has been denied to so many people just because of who they are. And I would never deny that to someone from, there's a guy in the far right, there's a member of the far right, there's a guy that basically supports a Nazi party who basically goes for coffee 100 meters from here, right in that direction. I see him like twice a week. And he's there wearing like all the neo-Nazi fashion brands just to make a point that's who he is. And I'm never less than friendly and courteous. Why? Because I refuse to dehumanize him. But also there's a grief there. Because even if we do connect someday on a level that's actually more than just merely courteous, the grief is, why did it have to take this long? Mm. Why did it have to take so long to convince you that I was human? What are we doing? And that's the grief that never goes away, I think. That will always break my heart.
And yet it feels to me, you are so somehow available to other people. Like you're.
But Cathy, we have to be. Look, we both, look, we have to be. Look, the other day I was in a class and someone said, oh, like, how do you stay so positive? You've experienced all these difficult things. And I was like, well, I've lost so many friends. I lost a friend, a guy played football together. We were like played up front together for like years. He died in a car crash at 20. One of the best writers I ever met, Tom Fennick, died at 23, stomach cancer. The cancer went away, then it came back and it took him, it was gone. Graham Joyce, one of the best novelists the world's ever seen. When he passed, Stephen King was like, we've lost one of the greats. 4 children, cancer took him like that, bang. Like these are all close friends, football teams. Ian Toothill, 48 years old, bass player in a band. Like you remember all of them. Just like last year, a great friend of mine, Richard Diffenthal, died of a heart attack while out walking his dog. And he was the year below me at law school. And he always believed in me. Like 14 years ago, he was like, they're wrong about you. Like your writing's going to take off. Just stay patient. Like all these people I've lost. And I think to myself, if any of these people had the chance to have one last meal with their loved ones, they'd take it. If they had one half day to spend, and I always think of them, it's why I never get too down, because I'm always thinking, Musa, you've got, no matter what you've experienced, no matter what difficulty, you still live, you still breathe, and that's enough. So go out there and actually have gratitude and treasure it, because it's all this is about in the end. It's all this is about.
Yeah, it was just so beautiful. You talked about, this is one of the things that I think there's a bit in the book where the writer talks about that some of the ways to keep going are kind of embarrassingly simple.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things I've often struggled with this, because I used to really struggle. What I find is that like a lot of the practical things that do keep the show on the road for me, that keep me here, they're so banal and ordinary. And when someone else is suffering and says, what should I do? It just feel embarrassingly simple to say, well, okay, I mean, if you want to, I will tell you what I'll do. Yeah. So I kind of thought that was interesting. So I wondered if you just tell us a bit about the sort of the embarrassingly simple ways to press on.
Well, it's like, I know it sounds, it's a bit of a cheat guide, but let's say you write a to-do list of like 20 things and set yourself a series of extremely basic tasks. Like not even like filing an invoice, even that is that's too complicated, but simply the act of putting on a tracksuit, going across the road and getting a croissant. Just a simple act of like locomotion, if possible, or texting someone to check in, or sending someone a voice note, connecting with the outside world, or let's say compiling a playlist of music, which is only comprised of songs that are uplifting. So for example, one thing I did a few years ago was just cut out any songs at all that had any tragic, painful, sad content. There was just no room for that. I thought to myself, I was almost quite brutal, quite militant. I was like, and I actually composed a playlist on Spotify called Winter Becomes Summer, which I basically like, I took the most brutal day in Berlin as one of the deepest winters. The January in Berlin is one of the worst. And I basically put together a playlist and I thought to myself, if this playlist can cheer you up on a day like this, then it's going to be good all year round. And that's what I did. So, again, sort of really basic, but just basically conditioning myself mentally all the time to be at my most optimistic. And there's a great thing that Michael J. Fox said. He said, with gratitude, optimism becomes sustainable. So if you're always grateful for stuff, then it's always possible to keep like looking forward and keep, so I'd be grateful for, oh, I can listen to a nice tune, or I can be in touch with a friend before bed, like to make me feel good, or I can watch a nice series before bed. And like, small things like just never going to bed grumpy. Those are huge. They're huge.
Another really interesting practical thing I thought was there's a bit where the writer talks about having learned how to cry in public. Which,
Oh
as
my God.
I'm a huge crier.
Yeah.
I do this thing now actually when teaching workshops where I just say to everyone, like, I say, I'm not trying to make anyone feel bad, but writing the self is often really profound. And
Yeah.
if you unlock one of those sealed places, and if you want to weep, then like do what you need, but I won't be embarrassed by your tears. I think the world would be a better place. Like, why? I never understand, why is it okay to shout at people in a supermarket car park but not start crying?
I think I know why, actually.
Oh, tell us.
I think because everyone's just holding on.
Mm-hmm.
And I think if people started crying, there'd be an epidemic and people be afraid they'd never stop.
Yeah.
People are terrified. If people are shouting, then at least the shouting indicates some form, as we're conditioned, of defiance. But the crying, I remember talking to a family member and I was talking about, like, I said, look, I think so-and-so is depressed. And this relative was like, we're all depressed. We've all been through hell. And I suddenly thought, oh, actually, yeah, this is about so much trauma from being refugees, my extended family, and fleeing terrible things, that if you actually stopped and wept, you'd never stop weeping.
Mm-hmm.
And you saw it, you see it at like funerals, like Ugandan funerals, because these people have been through everything. Like our ethnic group, the Acholi, at one point we had, I think, one of the highest child mortality rates in the entire world in the late 90s. It was horrifying. We experienced 2 straight genocides. The second was even worse than the first, if possible. And when you see elderly Northern Ugandans die, and when you see people weep, that is the grief. That's what I call compound grief. Layers upon layers upon layers. Like, people are crying and their bodies are shaking in ways that, like, because the human body is expelling all of it. And you see that, my God, it's been buried in these people for decades. And that's why people are terrified of crying, because there's so much to cry.
I found out recently, I didn't know this, but apparently tears have a painkiller in them, like a natural painkiller.
Wow.
I think that's nice.
That's fascinating. That tracks, actually.
Yeah.
I talked to friends about this. They're like, oh my God, I said, you need to have a good cry.
Yeah.
Let it out, and then pass out. Go home, have a good cry, fall asleep, wake up a couple hours later, having recharged, and then we move.
Yeah.
But you have to cry first.
So I wonder, would you pass on the tip to us about how to cry in public?
This is all about the handkerchief, isn't it? Like, so your eyes don't go red. Oh my goodness, yes. I don't know how I worked this out, but basically, like, the key is not to get the red eyes. I don't know if this is actually true or urban myth, but basically, like, if you hold, this is sound like I'm going to sound wild for this, but I found out when I would like have these really awful moments, I'd have the tissue as close to the eye as possible, so it wouldn't get reddened.
Yeah.
So it would almost look like a blotting paper. So then, like, you held the tissues there when you're having the real kind of like sob, then actually be like, I got away with this.
Yeah.
Normally the kind of like quieter, like train carriage, but yeah, that's how it had to be. But I used to blag like that. And this is before I used to wear sunglasses. I mean, now it's much easier. You can just, like, cover up the whole thing. But back then it was like, press the tissue to the eyes so they don't go red. So word to the wise.
Fairly soon, delightful audience, I'm going to move to your questions. So if you would like to put questions in the Q&A area, that would be...
Look at that, good numbers, eh? Good numbers.
Yeah, it's wonderful, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I find it very heartening that people will come together to talk and think about grief, because as your mother experienced and you've experienced, nothing's ever improved, I don't think, by nothing's ever improved, is it really, by secrecy or by
there's a thing, the stoicism gives people strength, doesn't it? People feel there's a stoicism, I think, the carrying on and pushing through, but there's damage though as well. there's a great damage we do to ourselves if we don't process, I think, after a certain point.
And I think that what there often is, even when there isn't very much else in the way of consolation, when things are really tough, certainly something that always hugely helps me is the universality of it. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I like reading books. But equally, I find when it's just all in your own head, it can feel really like hyper personal, and this is all mine.
Yeah.
When I read someone else's book or talk to someone else, I sort of think, oh yeah, the circumstances are different, but actually kind of the mechanic. I mean, this is the business of this is what I'm being. I'm just being a human being who something has happened and I didn't want it to happen, and I am sad. And hearing that other people feel like that way is a consolation for me, and takes the edge off a bit somehow.
I totally understand, Cathy. Actually, it's funny, before I forget, I was in Paris. I spent a month in Paris quite recently. Just went there for I was renting a flat for a friend who was traveling. And one of the things that I did was I'd get on the train from Gare du Nord, the main station, and go all the way up to the countryside, all through the banlieue. And I would go and I'd take a walk through the countryside, and I'd go to cemeteries and just walk through, these cemeteries are like 2 p.m. So no one else is around but me, basically. And you go and look at some of the gravestones and the stories they tell. And one of them in particular was a guy who, bless him, he was born in 1959. He had his daughter, him and his wife had the daughter when in 1976. And she only lived for a year. And then he died about 30 years after that. And they were buried in the same grave. And I just thought, he was with this, and he was quite old by the time he had her, and not quite old, but he was sort of late 20s, his life was up and running, he was moving. To lose someone that you'd look forward to meeting for so long. And I just thought there was a grief there. And it was funny because being in that, this was the kid died in 1976, they were both long gone by then, but there was almost a moment I had where I was kind of not grieving, but just witnessing them, and just thought it would be really nice if a complete stranger came along 30 years from now or whatever, and stood over our grave and just gave us a moment and was like, I'm sorry this happened to you. I'm sorry this was your story. So there's grief, which is universal. And also in that case, it was almost communal. It was me just spending some time and going I'm sorry this was your story, because you both deserve better. And not knowing anything about them other than the story the gravestone told.
I really love graveyards. And apart from anything else, I'm really glad you do, because last night I was driving by the graveyard with my son, who's 13, and said something about I haven't been to that graveyard for ages, I'll have to have a go. He said, Mum, it's so weird the way you're always hanging around graveyards. And I now feel that as soon as we finish this, the first thing I'm going to do is going to find him and say, well, you know what, I'm not the only one got time in graveyards looking at the graves, thinking about the people. It isn't just me. Perhaps if any of our audience are also what I call it graveyard loitering. If anyone else finds that consolation, they might share with us. So I'm going to, it's not so much a question, says Linda, but it resonated with me. She says, when you were talking about faith, and she says, when her husband died 30 years ago, someone said it's part of God's great plan. And she could only reply, well, God's plan stinks. I know often people do struggle when other people try to give them a sort of that kind of everything happens for a reason, or the one I've always thought is very dodgy, which is, God wouldn't give you more than you can handle, which to me always seems, I'm not sure I quite like the idea of the Almighty working out the precise calibration of what I'll be able to cope with.
Yeah, I got to say the calibration is very much off, I would say. Yeah.
I wondered and you said about I just wondered what your thoughts are on that, and whether you have anything to offer us. I think it's often well-meaning. That's the other thing. When I've been on the receiving end of that, I don't like it, but I'm also have often been aware that the person saying it is trying to be helpful, and I've not, again, then in that awful funny grief thing that happens where you're dealing with your own grief and you're trying to kind of not make people feel, I don't know, embarrassed because they've said something silly. I don't know what you think.
Well, it's because it's so awful, and people have that well-meaning people fall into that trap of, what can I say? Actually, there's nothing you can say.
Mm.
And it's accepting there's no eloquence, there's no whatever, nothing, there's not enough. The one thing you can give someone is space to grieve in your presence.
Mm.
People mock the concept of safe spaces. One thing I despise about a lot of this discourse around safe spaces is mocking something that's really important. Creating a safe space for someone to grieve, for someone to be broken on an ongoing basis in your presence is the best thing you can give them. Mm-hmm. It's the best you can give them. And people actually are going through it and they're not okay for weeks on end, for months on end, for years on end. They're not okay. And they may never be okay. And that's fine. That is the gift you can give someone, actually. Mm-hmm. And it's not even about talking. It's about just showing up and being present. Mm-hmm. And that's not just grief for losing someone, a loved one. It's the grief for the life they might have lost. Mm-hmm. So, friends who are chronically ill, who suddenly can't do all the things they were able to do, it's creating space for that in your routine. It's going in the extra mile for them. And I think someone mentioned the insensitivity or whatever. People are afraid of grief. Is terrifying because it reminds us of our mortality and it makes us panic. Because actually a lot of us walk around not thinking we're immortal, but not having to deal with the fact that we're mortal. And to be suddenly reminded of it. And sometimes the greater injustice, the greater apparent insensitivity. So like, someone dies of, cancer at like 6 years old, 7 years old. There's no logic to that. There isn't, in my opinion. And so people come out with these statements about it being part of someone's plan because how else does a human process something so unfair? I think. Mm-hmm. That's my own view, though. That's my own view.
Kay is asking, she says, Musa, thank you for your beautiful insights. I needed to hear your words today. Thinking of how traumatic events can propel you into grieving the other life you never got to live, how do you grieve that and make peace with where life has gone?
It's so difficult because I know some people who experienced such terrible traumas inflicted upon them, and there was a life they were living that was beautiful and it was gorgeous. And the only thing I can say is, again, that think of those people who came and went that never had a chance to make it right just because they no longer breathe. And you must cling to whatever you can, whether it's a favorite record or a chapter of a novel or a friendship or a voice note telling you you're incredible or a post-it note on a bathroom wall that you've put there in your lowest moment. Cling to it. That's all. It's really just, one of the best pieces of advice I ever got from a friend of mine, shout out to Greg, a friend from uni. I was going through a terrible time at university. Like university, there's a period of my life I still haven't written about because it's too traumatic. It's too traumatic. Like my early 20s to my mid 20s, I almost it was bad. Mm-hmm. I cannot write about that yet. And I was at the start of it, I was going through it, and Greg said, remain functional, Musa. Mm-hmm. Remain functional. This was to clarify. So when I was 22 years old, I was at uni, I was the college vice president, had a law degree, had a great job, lined up straight out of Oxford. Like, I was flying. I'd navigated private school, been through Eton, integrity intact, been through a lot of difficult things, but still managed to come through like all fine. And then I came out as bisexual. And my culture, like Ugandan culture, is particularly homophobic. Mm. And I was like, I'm done. I cannot deal with this. It almost broke me because I'm like, my culture is proud of me at this point. All the things I'm doing with my life, all the stuff my personal, professional life, and now they'll be ashamed. And I was completely right. Like, we've just seen in Uganda a few weeks ago, this law they've passed, about LGBT people, which is basically like, at worst, there's the death penalty that's being withdrawn now, but they might still push it through, who knows? And I began to grieve because I'm like, I will never be accepted fully in my homeland, by my people. And the only thing that kept me going was the knowledge that I was still breathing, and I was smart, and I was resourceful, and I had a chance to turn it around. And you can never look back. This is the thing, Cathy, the regret will kill you. If you look back at the life that your trauma stole from you, the regret will eventually kill you. You cannot look in the rearview mirror. And that's the only reason I survived, actually. if I'm honest.
And do you think, I'm not in any way, I'm not trying to make you tell us anything else about that time, but I'm interested that you said, I can't write about it yet.
Yeah.
Again, I find in my own writing that it's like I don't want to write about things, but actually writing about stuff is made them, you know, it will help.
I'll go there one day. I'll do it one day.
You will one day. Yeah.
I will. It's because it's the most brutal, emotional, spiritual experience I've ever had. And the thing that saved me was community. Actually, shout out to Stonewall FC football team, because, you know, the homophobia that I was experiencing from within and from my community and from society and all of that was so severe. The only thing that saved me, actually, weird enough, was actually football. An incredible football team of queer men, so both gay and bisexual men. And I went to play for them in 2003, the 2 seasons. And the community and the friendship I found there, some of those still endure. I was actually watching, shout out to my mate Pete Ned, we watched John Legend together a few weeks ago. So the friends from that team have endured 20 years later, and they're the ones that saved me, actually, their compassion, their kindness. So yeah, but that was a period that was really, really tough. And I think it was Kay who said, yeah, like, how do you get past the grief? Well, I think find community. To stop grieving your old world, find community in your new one. That's the key.
There is some sort of process of the antidote, isn't it? You know, like
yes.
The life is full of pain. So it's like it's not really expecting that it's going to be anything other than full of pain. But then having I love what your friend said, remain functional, and then search out your antidotes of community.
And actually, antidotes are a great point, because antidotes, of course, they're comprised of a small amount of the initial poison. So at some point, the antidote involves going back sometimes to the scene of the greatest pain, whether that be a spiritual place or a physical place. In my case, I did both, actually. I returned to both those places, and I emerged stronger. And now it's so strange, actually, Cathy, like, my life it was brutal in my mid-20s. But if you'd said to me at 43, you'll be where you are now, my life is further ahead than I could ever have dreamed, even when it was good. Like before things really fell apart. So when I was like 18, 19 years old, if you'd said to me at 43, you'll be doing this, I'd have been like, oh my God, I'll take that. without looking at the price tag.
That's beautiful. I'm very glad. I'm going to, Donna just wants to say that your work and words are important to her, and she wants to thank you for your incredible openness. A bold win for our age, she says.
Don't make me cry. Making me emotional. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm having a little secret. I've been having a little weep for a little while, which is because we're having such an amazing time together. Marisol has quite a practical question, so I'll read it all. My son's dad died of COVID at 54, and it's hurtful when people make insensitive comments, such as he must have died of something else because COVID alone doesn't kill people. How should we respond without being rude?
I think you should be however you feel, to be honest. I don't think it's your shame to carry a good friend of mine, Grant Wall, he died in the Qatar World Cup of a heart attack. A lot of people wrote to me and they were like, oh, it must have been the vaccine. Like, the man had been dead for hours. Grant was a friend of mine. He'd been dead for hours. I'm getting messages going. And I'm quite restrained, quite composed. But I actually don't think there's a duty to pacify the ignorance of others. And I'm not trying to be aggressive in that sense. I'm saying, if you're in a place of grief and hurt, as someone says he can't die, like, he can't die to that, well, I'm just like, well, actually, like, the facts of his death help other people to take better measures, to be more careful. And also, frankly, like, screw you. I hope no one is ever as cruel to you as you're being to me, like, intentionally or otherwise. I hope no one is ever as cruel to you. But then just leave it, because there's no discourse to be had with certain people. I mean, that's, I would just even almost say, are we not enough pain already? Like, how much more pain do you want to inflict on us? We're already in the worst possible pain. How much more can you inflict on us? Anyway, yeah.
Thank you.
That's one situation I wouldn't be necessarily diplomatic, I have to say.
Jason, this question is, I'm curious about the intersection of grief and anger. I feel like I'm constipated and confused by both of these emotions. And my grief wants to manifest in anger, but my childhood examples of anger discharge were harmful and scary. I'm not sure of these questions, but I'm curious about your thoughts on these two emotions. Yes,
I
anger
think, yeah.
so hard, isn't it, sometimes?
I mean, the problem with anger is, you know, when we were kids, we used to for a game, we used to turn on the hose, the garden hose, and like just to the full, and then it'd start thrashing around the yard. And then we used to laugh about like trying to capture it before it, and it was impossible to grab the hose because by then it's thrashing around. And that's what anger does, basically. It's very few people that can actually use anger and channel it. And now I've been able to channel my anger for many years because I've just been through a lot. But I really just think that, and this is an obvious thing to say, but actually specific professional help where you go to a therapist and just say, and actually just spell out, look, this is the challenge. And don't treat it like therapy in a big daunting way. Just treat it as like going for an MOT. Like an MOT, like you've got like, one of the axles is a bit funny and actually need a bit of a road check because it's not roadworthy. And the human mind at a certain point is not roadworthy. And so even if you do have anger at a certain point, just go and work out where it's coming from, process it. And I think the thing about therapy that's been amazing was it gave me a framework to navigate anger. So anger is inevitable, right, in the course of daily life, but therapy helped me work out how to park it and actually how to move me forward. That's all I'd advise.
That's lovely, thank you. And lots of love to you, Jason. I know that anger can I think it's really beautiful the way you express it as being constipated and confused by both of them. And I think that's a really good way of sort of pinning down how difficult it can be.
Yeah, well, see, that thing, that quote about Celia saying anger can be pain's bodyguard. Yeah, absolutely. And also, anger can be pain's bodyguard. And also the problem is this, anger can also be the fireman that locks you in the burning building. Right. So I think it's a difficult thing because anger can restrain, but also like it's a controlled explosion and you're still blowing up either way. So there's a danger. I think there's this, it works to a certain extent. And I've been there as well. I understand that. And also there's that extra element of, okay, pain's bodyguard, but where's the healing going to come in? That's the healing. That's the important part, I think. Yeah.
I'm very wary of my own anger. I find it very difficult to deal with. And I've got friends who, activists who feel that they can channel their anger in an effective way. But yeah, I can't do it. I just would set fire to myself and other people. It just never feels like it's in any way a good thing. So
actually, my best writing is actually my angerist writing. Yeah, and I call it moral fury. So basically, there's a thing that happens with me where I will feel this, but the way I filter my anger is like very, very precise. So I actually have written stuff before where I said that's the angriest piece I've ever written. Actually, Black Lives Matter, there's an essay I wrote called Nazis by the Lake, if you get a chance to find it. But Nazis by the Lake is the angriest thing I've ever written. I wrote it when I was shivering with rage. And my friend read it and he said, that's the calmest thing I've ever read. And I said, it's fury, it's moral fury. It's when you've processed the rage to such a degree that you're like, this is how I aim it. So yeah, my best stuff is actually my angriest. Yeah. Furious. Yeah. Real talk.
I'm very pleased to see that that we're not the only graveyard loiterers. So thank you everyone for reinforcing graveyard story.
Look at that great audience. We kept the audience. We kept them the whole way through. That's thanks everyone.
And I've been saving this question for the end.
Oh my goodness.
So M. Brayley, hello M, says, I wondered what poetry or pieces of literature by a writer apart from yourselves would you recommend? I know there will be lots, but do you have favorites, please?
Sylvia Plath. Sylvia Plath, just collected poems, just unbelievable. The Thin People is one of my favorites. Just that whole, anything Plath writes, but also Kurt Vonnegut. Just the generosity of spirit, the kindness. Vonnegut just... is it Welcome to the Monkey House or Breakfast of the Champions? It's a big compilation I kept on my desk for years. I don't know where it is now. It's lying around somewhere, but yeah. Vonnegut and Plath, they're the ones, they're my go-to.
That's lovely. So thank you very much, everyone. Oh, and someone very helpfully, thank you, Catherine, has put the link to the Nazis by the Lake.
Oh yeah, thank you. Oh, absolute star. Thank
in
you
the
so much.
chat. So that's great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all of you. Musa, thank you so much for your everything, for your compassion and for your openness and your willingness to be a human and a forgiving one, I think.
Thank you for the amazing questions. Thank you really for the searching questions, for engaging. And I know you've obviously been through it. And thank you to everyone for turning out as well and listening so patiently. Like, that means a lot. Like, it's I really appreciate it. I'm very, very moved, actually.
And what I thought, and I might not get to the end of this without crying, but I do want to tell you, is that when you were talking about how the really difficult, you know, the bit you haven't written about yet, the traumatic time and coming out as bisexual, and how difficult that was. And what I thought was, the thing is though, you exist. So because you presumably didn't really have anyone like you to look at.
No.
It's in the future, you exist for other people, and other people will feel less alone and will feel less shamed and will feel less shunned.
Oh, Cathy, that's exactly why. That's why, can I just say before everyone goes, that's exactly why I'm out in all of my work.
Yeah.
I made a decision in 2007 when I started writing about football. People asked me like, oh, we're going to be out. And I said, yeah, I need to be out because there aren't people, I can't see people like me. And I just thought to myself, I'm talented enough and resilient enough to make it despite the setbacks. And it's going to be worth it, because at some point one day, people will look at me and be like, it's easier because that guy's there, because I didn't have anyone there. So I appreciate you saying that. That's exactly why I did this.
Yeah.
And I'd do it again the same way. I'd do it again.
Yeah. And it's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful gift that you've given.
Thank you.
That you are
Very kind.
So thank you to you. Thank you to all of you, beautiful audience. We have reached the end of our time. As I said earlier on when we were all filtering in, it's wonderful that technology does facilitate these conversations over these distances. I always find it so hard, and the better it's been, the harder it is now, just to sort of like, you know, click the leave meeting button and you know, just go off on your own and put your own kettle on.
Oh no. That's devastating. That's the saddest thing anyone said. The whole
Yes, it is, isn't it? I am going to go put the kettle on, but I'm also going to go and tell my son that lots of people enjoy hanging around in grave rooms. And I'm sure lots of us also are going to read that Nazis by the Lake essay. And I hope you, Musa, have something nice and nourishing that you can do with the rest of your evening.
I do indeed. I can't wait. I've got some friends I'm going to go and see now, actually. I can't wait to see them.
That's great. Well, I'm so pleased. And farewell to everyone. And thank you so much for, even on Zoom webinar, I think we feel the quality of your attention. And I think there just has been a lot of love here tonight, and I've really felt it.
Cathy, before you leave, before everyone goes, and before I just want to embarrass you very briefly, you've been an amazing host, and I know you've navigated your own challenges. So I'd encourage anyone to check out your work as well. Not just your own memoir, but your sort of self-help guide for other writers. But yeah, an absolute pleasure, and I hope to see you soon enough for a coffee or something stronger in the near future. I look forward to it.
Thank you. Thank you to you. Thank you to everyone. And I'm now going to leave meeting and get on with the rest of my evening, as everyone else will. Thank you.
Take care, gang. Have a nice one. Bye.